Hi everyone, it's Cece. I hope you guys enjoy this special video. It's of me speaking to one of our residents about Sojourner Truth, who is our weekly topic for discussion today as part of our Suffragette Summer. If you are interested in being part of this project and being a special guest on the show, please let me know. I would love to come visit with you and talk to you about some really incredible women's history as we kind of dive into it and study ahead of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which is a really, really cool thing we get to celebrate this year. So anyway, hope you guys are having a good day, and I hope you enjoy this video. Bye. So Betty, have you ever heard the name Sojourner Truth?
No, say it again.
Sojourner Truth.
No.
Okay. So this was Sojourner Truth. You see her picture.
Is that a lady?
Yes, she has a very strong jaw. She is a lady. So Sojourner Truth, she was a suffragette, so she was pro the women's vote, and she was a abolitionist, so she was anti-slavery. And she actually escaped from slavery.
Is she black?
She's black. I know, it's hard to tell with the sepia tone pictures.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so it says, as an she was a preacher, abolitionist, and women's rights activist. She spoke out against injustices affecting various communities. Propelled by her faith, Truth traveled extensively to speak about her experiences as both a woman and a former slave. Although the most popular quotes attributed to her legacy are inaccurate, Truth's activism led to her to become one of the most recognizable figures in American history. Which is interesting because you hadn't heard of her.
Right.
And there's lots of people who haven't heard of her.
No, I didn't. But there has to be a leader there somewhere.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a little bit about her life. All right. So she was born in New York in 1797 into slavery. This was the house.
That doesn't look too bad.
It actually doesn't, but I think this was the estate. So
and she was probably the maid.
Yeah, so she was one of the slaves on the estate. Her parents worked on the estate for a small cottage and farm. Oh, actually, so this might have been her cottage and farmland to cultivate crops. She was the youngest of 10 children. Her life was marked with a swift transition. Many of her siblings were kidnapped and sold.
Oh, so that was a bad time.
It was, yeah.
And imagine that. I know families were split, husband, wife, children. How sad.
It's so sad. She was sold for the first time at 9 years old.
Oh.
And she was sold twice within a 2-year period before she was sold to her final master, John Dumont. So she had a rough upbringing. So at the turn of the 19th century, enslaved Africans living in rural areas surrounding New York State were often Afro-Dutch. Have you ever heard of that, Afro-Dutch?
No. They came from Holland?
So they were, yeah, so it was mixed between like Holland and African.
Oh.
Yeah, so they were Afro-Dutch. Their first language was Dutch. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, it is. I never would have thought of that.
Yeah. And so she actually had a really strong Dutch accent as well, which can you imagine? I mean, so she didn't understand English because she only spoke Dutch. When she was sold to her new master, he spoke English, and she would be beaten for not understanding the English demands. Yeah. So
bad time
and rough time of it. But I think that's why this story is important, because she had a really rough life and she made something really beautiful out of it. So it has a happy ending, don't worry.
I like a happy ending.
I know you do. Truth learned to speak English but never lost her Dutch accent or learned how to read and write, which is pretty common.
Well, Bill's parents came over from Germany.
Did they?
They had a hard time learning to speak. I mean, they spoke German.
Yeah.
And so learning English was hard. And like Bill's father learned to write, but his mother didn't learn to write.
Yeah.
But they did learn the language. the American language, because they spoke German. And Bill was the youngest of 10.
Oh my goodness. So
Yeah, and they all spoke German then, but they forgot. They didn't really remember it.
That's pretty fascinating. 10 children was more common back then. I can't imagine having 10 kids.
Well, the thing is, they were farmers and they needed help on the farm.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's how I think they knew what to do. They must have.
So it turns out while she was enslaved by her last master, Truth fell in love with an enslaved man named Robert from a neighboring farm. His masters, the Catlins, did not want Robert to have children he didn't want them to have children that they could not benefit from. So if he had children with a woman from another farm, they couldn't use those children.
Oh.
So that was a little bit twisted.
So did they get married, but they were allowed to have children?
So their slave owners forbade their relationship.
Oh.
So after years of enduring physical abuse, Truth walked to freedom. Dumont had agreed to grant her freedom on July 4th, 1826. When Dumont refused to release her, Truth emancipated herself, inspired by her conversations with God. So she was a very strong woman of faith. Truth left Dumont's farm just before dawn to get away undetected. Although Dumont pursued her, Truth was able to stay with members of her Dutch Reformed Church. Along the journey, Truth was baptized and was compelled to change her name to Sojourner Truth. She later dictated in her autobiography, she focused on her religious experiences that motivated her to seek justice for all. Okay. All right, so this is the big part. This is why Sojourner Truth is well known. She's known for this speech called Ain't I a Woman?
It's called what?
Ain't I a Woman?
Oh, okay.
Do you recognize that?
No,
phrase?
but no.
Yeah. So she gave a speech at a women's rights convention, even though she wasn't invited. She attended the meeting and spoke up during a discussion. The words she spoke were thoughtful and reflective on the social climate. However, a decade after the convention was held, fellow attendee Frances Dana Gage, she kind of manipulated what Truth said and wrote her own version of it.
She looked mean.
It goes to her. So this is Dana Gage. And she kind of took what Sojourner wrote and made it fit her narrative. So in her report, she says that Truth was fiercely condemning gender inequality and detailed her strength, ability to work, and the loss of her 13 children to slavery. But Sojourner, she only had 5 children. So she kind of was just exaggerating her story instead of taking it for what it was.
Probably made her more important.
Exactly. So what they say is in the Gage's portrayal documents Truth in the slave dialect, which she did not have a slave dialect. She spoke Dutch. But it evoked imagery of the mammy stereotype of enslaved women. However, this inaccurate version has often been accepted as historical fact. So she kind of
took over.
She took it over. She downplayed the importance of the speech and made her sound more of a loud Black woman was
she black?
No, this woman was white.
Yeah, she looks white.
Yeah, look at that very thin lips. So that's kind of took over her history a little bit. But Truth attended and often spoke at meetings denouncing slavery and sexism. It is suspected she also attended the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. She maintained complex relationships with the leaders of various movements, including Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and William Lloyd Garrison. So one of Truth's friends published a more accurate account of her speech in the Anti-Slavery Bugle only a few weeks after the convention. So she gave this big speech. It got everywhere. Everyone knew about it. And then the Civil War happened. So she really did live through a lot. So This is a photo of
How old
Sojourner.
was she when she died?
So it seems, I believe she was 86 when she died.
She had a long life.
She had a very long life.
Yeah, 'cause that
Absolutely.
was long then.
Yes, because if she was born in 1796, I mean, that's a long time. So during the Civil War, Truth advocated for Union soldiers and assisted in the efforts of the National Freedmen's Relief Association and Bureau. Truth was arrested in Indiana for violating Indiana state law, stating that no person of African descent can enter the state, even though that law was rarely enforced. So she was released after 10 days and continued to assist in the efforts. She went door to door to collect Thanksgiving food for the 1st Michigan Regiment of Colored Soldiers in Detroit. And at the end of the war, Truth visited President Lincoln in the White House.
It's a good picture.
Isn't that a good picture? It says Truth's grandson, James Caldwell, also actively supported the Union. In April of 1863, Caldwell volunteered for the Massachusetts 54th, the 1st Black Regiment of Massachusetts. In this portrait, and if you look right here, she is holding a photo of her grandson. That's in her lap, because you know
cute.
they love her. She loved her grandbabies.
Well, did she get to keep any of them?
Yes, because she released herself from slavery. Could she
do that?
Well, she did it. That's what was fascinating about her. She emancipated herself, and she walked to freedom, and then she continued to do great work. She didn't, hide her. She kept speaking her voice, which is what makes her really important. So the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which abolished slavery, did not mean retirement for Truth. She continued to advocate and speak out in the name of justice under God. She famously fought issues such as the resettlement of freed people and women's suffrage. In her final years, Truth lived with her daughters in Battle Creek, Michigan. So she lived a very long life.
Yes, she did.
And she had a very...
Is that her?
Yeah,
She was skinny.
So this is a bust, a portrait sculpture of her. So it says she died of old age in 1883. She was about 86. Since her death, Truth's likeness can be found on paintings, statues, and within pages of history textbooks. Most recently, the U.S. Treasury announced that Truth will be featured on the new $10 bill.
Whoa.
Yeah. So
well, she would be happy to know that.
I think so. I think her family would be happy to know that. I think she seems like the kind of woman who wouldn't have cared because she had things to do. So the $10 bill, along with other suffragists. The design for the new bill will be unveiled in 2020 to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment.
2020. Are we going to have it?
So actually, and that's kind of the sad part, is they actually decided not to do those $10 bills for 2020, and they're more likely to be released in 2026 or 2030.
Well, that's quite a while.
Yeah, so, but I think she's a fascinating lady. She worked very, very hard and gave her life to other people.
Well, she sure did. As an activist, she accomplished a great deal.
She accomplished a great deal, and like we were talking about before about, peaceful protesting and things like that, she was one to go stand up and speak her truth.
And she wasn't afraid to do it.
She wasn't afraid to do it, and she wasn't violent. She was a strong woman, and she inspired a lot of other suffragists to move forward in the women's movement. And I think that's why she's the first one I'm diving into this week, because if you think about women's rights and how women wanted to vote, for a white woman, that would mean a lot, but for a black woman who, when there was still slavery going on, demanding her right to vote, that's a big leap.
Well, and she would have a lot of courage.
A lot of courage.
For sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So she was a really courageous woman, and I think it would be wonderful to have her on the $10 bill.
Yes. Well, it's a long time to wait.
I know.
If they're going to wait till it's 2010 or whatever.
Well, hopefully we'll be out of quarantine by then.
So you say.
All right. Well, thank you for sitting with me, Betty, and learning a little bit.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And I admire her for that time. It was very courageous.
Very courageous.
She would stand up for what she thought was right, and that they didn't kill her.
I know. I'm thankful she stood up and she fought, and she's still remembered to this day, which is pretty cool. I think that's a true American spirit.
Well, is there a book about her then
yeah. So there's
the young people in school, are they enlightened by her life?
I don't know. I hope so. I don't think that there's enough when we learn about history in school, I don't think there's enough women's history. Personally, like a lot of the people we learn about that changed the world are men.
Yes, so see, up until recently, women get paid as much as men, and women stand out as they're pilots. They do a lot of things that they weren't allowed to do before this.
Oh, you're absolutely right. It's a completely different world for women than it used to be.
Yes.
And that's because women like Sojourner and because they changed the world for us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so there's so much more opportunity.
See, like you probably just applied for this job and not knowing whether you would be getting it or not. And so because you're a woman, that didn't hinder you.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
So she started all that.
Yeah. So that's really powerful. It's a really powerful sentiment. So
yeah, I'm amazed that they let her do all that.
I think people tried to stop her, but I think she was not going to have any of that. She kept going
because she was strong-willed.
And as she was a woman of faith. I think she had, the Lord on her side and was.
He thought it was time for her to speak up.
That's right. That's exactly right. Oh.